Hello and welcome. Good evening. In this episode, we are going to summarize the events from the last few days along at the Ukrainian front, and we are going to talk about the two big things that happened. This is one, the Russian mobilization and how it's going on, what's going on there, what news we have about this, as well as there has been a prisoner exchange of quite an importance. But without further ado, let's start. Along the eastern front here, we have a few reports. The Ukrainian general staff is saying that the Russians actually attacked Kupiansk and they defeated them there. The Russians weren't successful, which is interesting because it shows that the balance of power here seems to be not this one-sided anymore, and at the same time the Ukrainian pressure is more or less gone at this phase, at this point. There are further Ukrainian attacks on Lyman. We have reports both in the south, Russians saying the Ukrainians tried to storm Yampil, but they failed, which is here. As well as we have the confirmation that Dobryshevo is now in Ukrainian hands. There were some rumors within the last few hours that the Ukrainians achieved something here. I can't really confirm it yet. There seems to be a push in this direction. Also northwards along the reservoir in this direction. But as of now, I actually didn't find solid confirmation yet. It's just a lot of rumor to a degree that I think it's probably likely that we see some push here at this very moment. But as said, I don't have the full confirmation of it yet, and I see okay, audio works for me. Audio is working. I don't see, yeah, it works. Okay, good. I was just concerned a little bit because somebody was shouting no audio. Okay, good. So this is what we have here. There seems to be some activity here yet, but as said, as of now, I was not able to fully confirm it yet, so we have just rumors in this regard. Anyways, the pressure on Lyman is continuing. The Russians claim the Ukrainians attacked it directly as well, which, if it happened, seems to be more a fixing action. To me, it seems highly unlikely that the Ukrainians actually try to storm the city here, as it would mean house-to-house fighting and unnecessary victims, unnecessary casualties, whereas they can push away the Russians if they are about to encircle it, and the Russians will have to retreat. And that would be, in this direction, a potential push that might be happening in this direction here as of right now. Further east, we have Ukrainians saying the Russians were attacking Vesele and they defeated the attack, which is somewhat interesting because it's already here. So this would be far past the, what is that road's name? M1302, I think, or T1302, far past that road going up here between Lysychansk and Bakhmut. So from this on southwards, basically, we have Russian attacks continuing like in the last days, like in the last weeks. I don't have specific reports about attacks on Soledar, even though it seems likely that they continued. And along the front line here, we see the Russians still pushing towards Bakhmut. There are reports that the Ukrainians are still in full control of the outskirts of the city, but after that it seems to be Russian presence. So basically what we see here, the outermost houses and industrial parts are still under Ukrainian control, but that's about it. After that, the Russians, there are the Russians. The Ukrainians say they defeated and repulsed attacks towards Zaitseve and Kurdimivka, which are here and here, again here. Somewhat surprising, far further to the west than so far. And again, we see basically the Russians more or less doing the same as the Ukrainians try with Lyman. We mostly have pushes around, while there is some push towards the urban center itself. It seems highly unlikely that in the current situation, either side will push into the houses, into the urban center either in Liman or in Bakhmut. Rather, both sides try to move around, threaten encirclement, and thus force a withdrawal of the respective forces. Further south, we have further reports of Russian attacks in the direction of Avdiivka, mostly not at Avdiivka itself, but like in a crescent moon around it. Again, the same tactics again. Avdiivka is heavily fortified and a strong point of the Ukrainian defense, so the obvious intention of the Russian side is to bypass it and threaten it with encirclement, so the Ukrainians have to pull back. This is more or less what's happening here. We have further Russian attacks along that whole front here without achieving too much. When it comes to the southern part of the front, the Russians claim they defeated and repulsed a Ukrainian attack close to Vuhledar, and there are still reports about further reinforcements arriving at Vuhledar. Now, in the Russian telegram, we are talking about this for 2 weeks now, more or less. The first reports about Ukrainian activity here that was pointing towards an offensive that is about to come. If this, whatever that attack was definitely not the offensive, and with the Russians claiming continuous resupply, continuous buildup of forces here, it seems fairly unlikely that this was a serious attack. If it was somewhat meant to achieve something, it was probably more reconnaissance than anything else. Whether this is actually a likely advance is a different question, because we see the two main roads we have here are running right parallel to the Russian frontier, and one is actually going to Marinka, where we have Russian activity right to the front, so reinforcements along both those roads in a serious offensive would be questionable. There are some side roads, as we can see here, but those lines of communications obviously have a limited capacity in a case of a serious offensive. And the rumors on the pro-Ukrainian internet, basically in the pro-Ukrainian circles, are that Ukraine has 3 divisions ready for attack. One of them is here in Kherson, one was here in Kharkiv, attacking there, and the third one supposedly is here pushing down, but the infrastructure doesn't really seem to support this. Now, I might be wrong here. We could be surprised in some degree, and obviously the whole division will not just attack at Vuhledar. That seems unlikely too. But as of now, I'm still highly skeptical if we can actually expect a serious Ukrainian offensive in this region. Both sides. The rest here from the southern part, both sides again accuse each other of shelling Zaporizhzhia power plant. The shelling, whoever it was, the shelling caused some damage and made the power plant being cut off, or at least a part of it, from the electric grid. This is important because as the power plant is being shut down or is shut down, that doesn't mean the fuel rods stop producing heat. So there is active cooling needed for weeks, at least weeks to come. I'm not completely sure whether for the exact time frame, but at this very moment, they definitely need active cooling. If that is breaking down, that would lead to the core melting. So what usually the power plants have for case of losing connection to the electric grid is that they have both batteries as well as generators. And in this case, the generator started up, kept the power plant supplied for 1 hour, and within that 1 hour, the workers at the Zaporizhzhia power plant were able to reconnect it to the power grid. So the situation there is somewhat under control, but still questionable as the shelling of the power plant occasionally continues. There was some issues with water lines as well. It seems to be fixed as well. And as said, both sides accuse each other of shelling it. And I said it in past situation reports. I'm not going to repeat myself in full here, but to me, the logical side would be the Russian one, as they have far more to gain with shelling the power plant than Ukraine has in basically every regard. But that's my estimation, considering each side's benefits from a shelling of the power plant. And I'm talking about shelling here, not a destruction. I see the Russian side having far greater benefits, so my guess would be it's likely the Russian side, but that's far from proof. In Kherson, we have further information. The The Ukrainians are still reporting attacks on the Russian infrastructure, on logistics and command structures. We have several images, videos, etc., proving that the attacks continue. Quite interesting that they still do their best to keep the supply from going into the right side, into the Russian bridgehead on the right side of the Dnieper. The bridges are being shelled. The pontoon bridges are shelled. The ferries are shelled, so they try to make it as hard as possible for the Russians to bring over supplies and to reduce the amount that's arriving. And the Russians are now trying to rebuild the Novakharkovka bridge in a very interesting way, to be perfectly honest. So what we have here is Novakharkovka. This is the dam. What we see here is the locks are the locks. So for ships to go from the Dnieper into the reservoir, this is the dam wall. And what we see here in yellow is the roadway along the bridge. Supposedly this part has broken down and this bridge has broken down. And what the Russians are doing now, we can see here, they're actually filling up the locks with gravel, as it seems. Now, I'm no structural engineer. I have no clue how well it's done. We just see one picture. There might be bigger boulders below it or something like this to give it more stability. But in general, as I have to say, it seems like a fairly smart move, not even trying to build some flimsy structure on top that could be destroyed by a hit or two, but instead just filling it up. Obviously, it destroys the locks, but there's not going to be any shipping supply going through that anytime soon. And for the Russians, the highest priority is now to keep their forces, their expeditionary forces, basically on the other side of the Dnieper, fully supplied. So filling it up might actually be a smart way, as damages to it should only create craters and should be fairly easy to fill up again. Now, this doesn't solve the question of the rest of the way here, but as I said, I think a fairly smart way to try to keep the supplies going, what we see here. How well it is constructed, as said, that's out of my field of expertise. I can't really comment on it. Let's go to the events on the front line itself. There has been Ukrainian offensive activity in the north. Lyubimivka, Petrivka, and Leninske are at least contested, if not conquered. I couldn't fully confirm it. So after first going here along the reservoir and then attacking Olhyne, Vysokopilia, Novovosnenske, along these areas, they are now basically taking the area in between. We still don't have any news about Arkhangelske. But the thing is, what we see is that the initiative is still lying on the Ukrainian side, even though there are still counterattacks. So here again, the balance of power isn't too far off. It's not completely one-sided. In the Inhulets bridgehead, I don't really have many news. So there is news about fighting. There are reports about fighting, but I can't confirm any advances, any significant advances in any direction. I haven't read about any town being taken or being lost, so it seems to be more or less static. The only information I have by name is that the Ukrainians continue to attack Davydiv Brid here north of the bridgehead and along the lines of communication along the Inhulets. In the south, the information I do have is that Pravdyne, which is here, is highly likely now in Ukrainian hands. Again, I think it was before as well, because there are Ukrainian reports about air attacks and shelling of it, while it was lately fully under Russian control. So it seems likely that the Ukrainians took it back. There's further fighting south along the coast, more or less along that front line, and Snihurivka has also been seen fighting lately, but no big territorial advances that are in any way reported. Now, we can obviously expect some changes in territory, especially in towns that are a little bit bigger. It might be that they take a line of houses or two at some point, but what we have not seen is any significant change in the territory. And at this point, it seems fairly appropriate to do at least a rough summary of the current events before we continue further. So what we see here in Kherson is a very slowly but still advancing Ukrainian offensive. in combination with destroying the bridges over the Dnieper, it seems to me that the Ukrainians are deliberately creating an attritional battle to increase the supply consumption on the Russian side to a degree where the Russians can't keep up with the supply with helicopter, with barges, with ferries, and with pontoon bridges as they are continuously being shelled. And obviously, the effect of that would be that the supply situation of the Russian bridgehead on the right bank of the Dnieper would deteriorate to a degree that their fighting power is also starting to deteriorate, and then allowing the Ukrainians to advance further. It doesn't seem to be aimed at any fast victory. It more seems to be actually at increasing the supply usage, while the Ukrainians have decided to accept the losses that are unavoidable in an intentional attritional battle. But the price for that campaign, Kherson, likely justifies the losses, as throwing the Russians on the other side of the Dnieper would allow the Ukrainians to shorten their front line, to take out units, to use them as reserves in other parts of the front, as crossing the river under fire is close to impossible and would at the very least cause extreme losses to whatever side is trying to cross it. Also, throwing the Russians off that side of the Dnieper saves Mykolaiv, Odessa, and obviously connection to Transnistria from ever being achieved to reach Russian hands, as the Russians don't have the amphibious capacity left to do any serious amphibious invasion along the coast that is still held by the Ukrainian side. In the south here, we have fairly little activity. As said, there is the pro-Russian Telegram is still reporting about troop concentrations and further reinforcements arriving in that area. Looking at the line of communications, I am somewhat hesitant to confirm that, to give that credence, I think is the English word. Because the supply situation, the lines of communication seem to be not solid enough for any serious offensive going in that direction. That would at the very least try to touch Volnovka, I think it's. So don't drink again, Euler. So this seems to be questionable whether we can evade an offensive here. The Russian attacks along the line, basically south of Bilohorivka down to Marinka, seem a little bit erratic, but at the same time, the fronts on the other side of the other fronts seem to have fairly stabilized again. Obviously, we see advances on this side. We see advances in Kherson, but there's no more collapse of the front line. So there might be some point to the furthering attacks. It is questionable, though, whether the losses justify the small gains. Here, on the other hand, around Donetsk, it seems increasingly likely that this is political pressure that is forcing the continued attack, as obviously Donetsk city and its infrastructure, its administrative buildings, is in range of even bigger mortars. So it can be shelled fairly easily from the Ukrainian positions, which will likely put political pressure on the military, on the Russian military there, to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. When it comes to Kharkiv, to the Kharkiv part of the front and down here, we obviously see the push on Lyman trying to bypass it, to threaten encirclement. If it is true that the Ukrainians achieved some breakthrough here in the north and they actually are cutting off the line here, that doesn't mean a Lyman evacuation is mandated yet. This would only be the case in case the last line of communication here is getting threatened. As long as this is considered to be safe, I don't see a necessity of full retreat yet if the Ukrainians are only somewhere up here and don't threaten to push to Zarichne at this very point. Yampil also still in hand. This seems that Lyman will likely hold out a few more days, but the Ukrainians push further. What we see further north seems to be fairly inactivity by the Ukrainian side. They have not tried to cross the Oskil further, just seem to be satisfied with consolidating their gains, whatever that reason is, whether it's just taking another breather before a continued offensive, or that the Russians have actually managed to solidify their defense along the Oskil River can obviously not be judged from that point, but we will have to see. Overall, the strategic initiative is still clearly with the Ukrainians, but the big breakthroughs that we have seen in Kharkiv here are no longer happening, at least as of now. On Crimea, we have something interesting. There have been reports about a big explosion at Sevastopol, and what happened is that the Russians blew up an unmanned ship, basically a floating drone, which they have taken pictures of here. Now, this is a type I've never seen before, and it seems to be fairly proficient in its construction. So that's not just something jerry-rigged in ad hoc, that at least follows a certain plan. In my Discord, as I've never seen that before in the Discord, they were talking about what it possibly is. And this was identified as likely being the ground station for, what is it called? Starlink, so an internet connection. This is a camera, and those are probably, those might be infrared lights, so the camera has a good visibility. And those ribs here are basically to break the waves, to make sure the camera and the ground station are not being covered and washed over, as this boat will likely lie very low in the water, and if it isn't made for reconnaissance, then it was likely a suicide boat loaded with explosive, which would also explain the big explosion, as destroying it just to destroy it would not require this many explosives that it is getting reported all over the Russian sources in the area. Whereas if it is loaded with 50, 100, 200, whatever, how many kilograms of the explosive, obviously the explosion being started with the Russian charge to blow it up would be quite audible. And the obvious target for a suicide boat would be in the background. I think that is a Russian LST, so a landing ship for tanks. In that case, it would further diminish the Russian fleet in case this was actually a suicide boat. So something fairly interesting, what I haven't seen before, but in itself probably just one sign of the Ukrainians professionalizing their own resources and now having started to try to do some construction to further push the Black Sea's fleet away. Now, we have, while there was mobilization while Putin called for mobilization, the volunteer units are still being raised. Several of the regions are still raising volunteer units, and also the recruitment of prisoners is continuing. Now, I have something here. I can't really confirm it. That's Yegor Komanov. He's a cannibal who hunted people to eat them and was caught in a car crash where there was apparently a body that was nibbled upon, and supposedly he's now fighting for Wagner Group. That part for Wagner Group I couldn't confirm, but I have found an article about him, about the Russian cannibal that's being imprisoned, and obviously a guy like this will not see the light of day and the unfiltered light of day anytime soon under usual circumstances, so he might actually be among the troops that. But this is kind of a rumor. Now, when we talk about the official mobilization, Putin has called for 300,000 reservists to be called upon. It should, under normal circumstances, not mean a substantial change along the front line until some months have passed. Russia doesn't have the infrastructure to use 300,000 men immediately. They aren't trained. They haven't gone to regular fresh ops like, for instance, the Swiss militia does in any ways. And usually you would expect the call up to take a while to process the people that are being called upon, and that they are not being called upon within 2 or 3 days, all of them at once. This at least is the conclusion if we assume that there's some resemblance of a Western system happening in Russia. We see this, for instance, in Ukraine, that Ukraine called general mobilization on day 1 of the war, but we haven't, and in theory, it was called that they have 900,000 reservists, and they didn't allow any men to leave the country in fighting age, I think between 18 and 65. So what we could have theoretically expected, especially as tens of thousands volunteered for the territorial units, in theory, if you just take the pure numbers, you might have expected on day 3 the Ukrainians had an army of 1.5 men. 1.5 not 1.5 men, 1.5 million men. Obviously, in reality, it's not the case. It's not even the case as of now, it seems. At least that's my information. I'm trying to get more information, but I haven't achieved it yet, how far the mobilization of the Ukrainians has actually reached at that point. Because the Ukrainians are calling them in parts and then try to train them up and then call the next part. So it takes a long time on the Ukrainian side to recruit them. And those offensives we see now started with Kherson and now then in Kharkiv. Those are offensives where the mobilized units are likely already playing a significant part. But as we all know, this is more than half a year after the war started. Just to give some connection how it would usually be considered. Now what we have, what might be possible though, and this is something that cannot be judged yet, but where we might know more within a week, is that the Russians actually don't care at all about the circumstances. Now, I have served, but it's a while ago, and I can say that I've probably forgotten a lot. I might now know more in other areas, but I'm pretty sure if you guys have served and are 10 years out of the military, you will acknowledge that you have gaping holes in your knowledge when it comes to how you are supposed to act in the field you were trained in. Especially if you're now being used just as infantry, you would lack significant knowledge. Now, if Russia is willing to accept that and is willing to accept chaos, then of course it could be a whole different story, that they basically just bus the troops towards the front line, bus them to Donetsk, a few thousand, 10,000, 20,000, hand them over to the local commander. He divides them up, hands them over to the lower commanders, and this continues until everyone is just getting a bunch of guys that have a rifle with them at best and maybe a backpack with their gear. Because the pictures I've seen, the mobilization is already going on, are of men in uniform already, in many of the cases, with military backpacks. What I know from the German system is that if you are like in the kind of active reserve, so you're not just reserve on paper, but you're supposed to appear within the next months and years again, you get basically all your gear except the weapons. You keep it at home, you have your backpack ready, you have everything, so in case you were called upon, apart from picking up your gun, you would be more or less ready to appear again. And I have no idea about the Russian system, but in case they have something resembling that, they have the uniforms at home, they have the backpacks ready with their gear, they might in theory be pushed in the front line within 1 week. Now, what would that result? That would be unorganized troops, demoralized troops, and troops without any refreshment training, so they would lack basic knowledge which can save their lives. If they don't know, if they have forgotten how to make a fire at night to keep themselves warm without the enemy seeing it, if they walk on the ridge lines in a way that they are visible and can get shot at, obviously all of this will be paid for in blood. If Russia decides that it will not care about human losses, this might very well be the case, and our conventional expectations that this mobilization takes months and months to play any effect might be surprised, might get a surprised reality shock within a week or two. And at least, and now we're coming to something else, we actually have some indications that this might actually be the case. Shoigu himself said the training will be at least a month. But the first news we have are like this here, for instance, in Kursk, which is right up here. In Kursk, the military commissariat has said reservists under 30 are being deployed immediately without any further training. Immediately. Now, again, we are talking about reservists here. A lot of them are former conscripts. They might be drawn into the army when they were 18. They have 1 year of conscription, so they left when they were 19, which means they might be up to 10 years out of the military without having performed any training, without having refreshed their knowledge, being trained further. Especially as the Russian reservist training supposedly is more like showing up than any serious training at all. At least that's what you read in the analysis. This might mean they send troops to the front line that are no way capable of holding up their own, but obviously it would fill up the troops fairly fast, even though while paying extreme losses. This at least would be an indication to that. There are also rumors, so far only rumors, coming out of Buryatia. That's, as if I'm not completely wrong, that's like in Central Asia, one of the Central Asian provinces, where there's a video from a woman. Now I couldn't translate it. For me, that's one more thing to make it somewhat doubtful. But according to the description, the woman says her husband, her father of 3, 4, or 5, is being called up to go to fight, and he has never been in the armed forces before. He doesn't have any military expertise. And this would show that if this is true, and I can't confirm this would show that they're actually calling upon people without any experience at all. And if they push those into the front line without any proper training, that will fill up the front lines fairly soon, but that will even faster fill up the graves behind them as well. And there are some indications this would be from Buryatia, so a national minority. And we have something here now from Dagestan, where they are arguing and fighting with the recruiters and tell them, we don't want to leave. We see it here. We don't want to fight for our future. The recruitment officer says, you need to fight for our future. And they say, we don't have a present. What future are you talking about? So this would be another national minority being recruited. And there are indications, if those things are somewhat connected, it might be an indication that the Russians are actually primarily, or at least with a focus on national minorities when it comes to calling up men. The demographics, I'm talking about this channel, I'm talking in this channel about the demographics in Russia again and again, because Russia's population is collapsing. They have far too few children. But if you filter out the ethnic Russian, it is even worse. There are several minorities who still have a healthy population growth, especially in the Caucasus, but in other regions as well. So if this trend were to continue, the Russian majority now would become a minority at some point in this century. And some of them are Muslims, for instance, as well. So the whole country might turn to a different religion, and the Russia would, talk about in ethnic terms, would no longer have a Russian majority. Now, this is obviously well known within the Russian circles. And if we see the losses, and if we see how much the Russian armed forces have focused on using minorities for this war, there are numerous statistics when it comes to the losses that the minorities are vastly overrepresented when it comes to the casualties. This might be another indication that they deliberately choose minorities to basically use up their excess sons while saving their single son men from ethnically Russian families. This would obviously also create some even more dissent within the Russian population and within the minorities in the future. Now, and the results of this we can see here. This is the head of Dagestan, of the province where this video was taken. And we see here him, as you can see, in front of pictures of the fallen, him honoring them. And this was not the first picture. Now we see this is a collection of all the other events. And as you can see, Dagestan is paying a significant price for this war. And this would be another indication. Everything I told you now when it comes to the reports from Dagestan and from the rumors from Buryatia, the other things are facts. What is my interpretation, or reported as rumors to you, what is my interpretation is that this call-up might have a focus on the ethnic minorities. There are some images about extremely long line of young men in Central Asia, in the Asian provinces, entering planes, etc., which would be an indication how big the recruitment has been there. But as of now, I can't fully confirm that, though. What we can confirm, though, is that the Russian men, at least in some part, aren't really, it was far easier to support that war when all you needed to do was paint a Z on your car. Now we see here, this is supposedly the Russian-Georgian border, and as you can see, you have one elderly woman here, and the rest seems to be young men. Young men that want to cross the border. This here is supposedly the international airport Vnukovo. And as you can see, I think here that might be an elderly woman or an elderly man. That isn't too young either. The rest more or less seem to be, at least in a vast majority, young men. And this is a picture from Google Maps that I took a few hours ago. So I took it for the first stream 6 hours ago. The situation might be a little different now. This is the Russian-Georgian border, and we have a traffic jam actually is clearing up a little. It was up to here, it was more or less red. For 7 kilometers, more or less no movement at all, despite Russians being able to enter Georgia visa-free. Now, is this likely that these are just weekend vacationers already starting an early weekend into Georgia? Fairly unlikely, though. So what we see here are Russian men trying to dodge the draft and the mobilization by getting the hell out of Dodge into neighboring countries. There are more informations, and the independent, one of the few independent newspapers in Russia, I think they are now publishing from exile, Novaya Gazeta. They are saying Russia actually wants to mobilize 1 million men. There was paragraph 7 on their, I have more here, there are paragraph 7 in the decree that Putin published. Originally supposedly said 1 million people, but it was changed for the publication. There are data dumps that supposedly show it's actually 1 million. I can't confirm that. There is no way for me to confirm this in time about the point, but the rumors are going on. And as you can see, the Telegraph is also reporting it, that supposedly it's 1 million, up to 1 million men. I think it's at least a realistic possibility, because we can't forget that Russia is controlling basically all the media, and this is a huge country. If a mobilization is called upon with 300,000, you expect a neighbor or two to leave, or even a few of them. That won't surprise you that they are being called upon, but you have no real way of confirming whether it's 300,000 or 1 million. You just know that people are leaving. And unless there is some independent surveillance within the country that is even able to publish it, it is purely up to the Russian government and the Russian military to know how many people were actually called upon. And this might be another way to use that. The advantages of this would be that one side, it is explaining why people are being called upon. It would also be a sign to the world. But at the same time, it would not frighten the Russian population as much as 1 million sounds far more frightening. It would display less weakness to the international community, to the international observers. Because if you only call up 300,000, that's a whole level different to 1 million. When it comes to the severity of the situation, if you actually think you can win with 300,000, it's obviously painting a far more positive picture of your own military capabilities. So this is something that seems to be possible. About the credibility of this yet, whether the Russians are actually calling up 1 million men, is out of my possibilities. But when we come back to what I said initially, if the Russians don't try a conventional mobilization, but basically just rush everyone to the front that they can push into a uniform, this would make even more sense, as these rushes to the front will cause tremendous losses, and those have to be replaced again. So calling up 1 million instead of 300,000 would, in this context, make sense in my understanding. There was the other big news is that there has been an exchange of prisoners, and the pro-Russian Ukrainian oligarch Medvedchuk, who is a personal friend of Putin and I think the godfather of his daughter, if I understand it correctly, so he's closely related to Putin. He was exchanged against at least 215 soldiers. It might be more, but I definitely confirmed 215. And among those 188 from the Azov battalion that were caught in Mariupol. Among those, all the commanders, all the Azov commanders, and even better, it included all those that were already sentenced to death within Donetsk, even those that were sentenced to death and supposedly being executed almost every day. And among those, the foreign volunteers as well. So the fairly well-known Cossack Gundi, a British man that was fighting in Ukraine, but he was fighting, I think, since 2018 within the naval infantry. Who became famous for his interviews that he was doing with some activists, or I don't know how you want to talk them. There are some persons online that do spread Russian propaganda and thus had access to them. They were interviewing them, and there were a lot of things that were fairly off, like Cossack Gundi showing up in an Azov shirt despite him never being in Azov. Then he admitted being a mercenary despite that being threatened with execution in his trial without him ever being a mercenary. He was in Ukraine long before. He was about to get his Ukrainian citizenship. He was fighting in the regular armed forces, and foreign volunteers don't are, according to the Geneva Convention, they are not mercenaries if they fight within the National Guard or the armed forces of the Ukraine under the circumstances like the International Legion. So there were various things, and there's a video of him singing the Russian anthem. Unfortunately, he seems to have gone like laying low now. He's not been on the public yet explaining his behavior, which would obviously be highly interesting. On my German channel, I then said that either he's off the rails, he's insane by now, or he was pressured to do all of those things because there was no logical explanation for his behavior. Now, I can't fully confirm that yet, but we see more pictures here, including them also the head of the Mariupol police, and we see the evacuees here. They are supposedly going to Turkey. I can't confirm it's actually all of the 215 or whether it's just the Azov commanders, but at least a part of them, at the very least, a part of them is not going to Ukraine but to Turkey. And from my understanding, they are going to be interned there. Internment is when armed forces cross the border into a neutral country. Then the neutral country, according to international law, has to disarm them and basically imprison them until the war is over. They don't have to be put into prisons. They can be in camps. They might even be allowed to go to the nearby village and work there or go to the supermarkets there. But the important thing is they and their weapons are not allowed, according to internment, to leave the country again. So this might be the case that all those being exchanged for Medvedchuk, the oligarch, might just be in internment now, not being fully freed, but that at least would mean they are safe from execution and safe from spontaneously exploding prison camps that are surprisingly well filled with Azov fighters, while there have been mass graves being dug behind the wall 2 days earlier, like it happened in the Donbass. We have a few more small informations, like there are some rumors spreading around the pro-Russian Telegram that North Korea supposedly has claimed they are never going to deliver weapons to Russia in the current conflict. I cannot confirm this now. This might just be a rumor. I also have some information that supposedly an Israeli company is now delivering to Poland for the Poles to hand it over to the Ukrainians, a system to fight off, to defeat small drones. This is surprisingly short time after Russia was receiving Shahid 136 drones. So those weapons might be in use of them, but Israel openly is still not supplying Ukraine with weapons, but the story says that they are going to deliver it to Poland, well knowing that the Poles are going to give it to Ukraine. I only found that on a website for private drones and not a proper news website, so that might be fake news. We can be somewhat careful. We should be somewhat careful with this. And the other information I have is that Germany is giving, I think, 36 military trucks and a few fuel trucks for Slovenia to hand over its M55S to Ukraine. Now, the interesting part is the M55S is actually a T-55. So the prolific Soviet main battle tank that is still in worldwide use. I think it should be the most built tank in world history, like with 80,000 built. Worldwide still in use, but obviously massively obsolete. Now, what use is this? This here is actually the predecessor of this here, which is the Soviet T-62M, and which is filmed here on the way likely to Ukraine, where the Ukrainians have already captured one. They are in use with Ukraine. So is this a worse tank? Now, here we see that the time of building doesn't necessarily mean that something is worse. The M55S has received the Blazer ERA from Israel. As far as I know, it's useless against ballistic rounds, so it's only good against ERA. But that doesn't really make much of a difference, because what it has received is this here. Its original 100mm gun was replaced by a 105, the L7 or an L7 derivative, which is the former standard gun, more or less standard gun within NATO, of which there is fairly potent ammo still available worldwide. As said, I often mention on this channel the M900, which is an American-developed APFSDS round for the 105, which is more or less a match even for the most modern Russian tanks. I can't confirm the Americans actually provide the Ukrainians with it, and I can't confirm they actually can be used in this very cannon, because there might be differences with the pressures or the breech or something like this. But in theory, at least, there can be highly effective rounds even for those. And what is even better are those equipments here. What we have is a laser warning receiver. So this tank is recognizing when a Russian tank is either doing a laser range finding to shoot and hit it, or when it's been marked with a laser to be fired upon with a guided missile. And once the alarm starts off, the tank can obviously use this here, which are smoke launchers, to cover its position and retreat, and has a decent chance of disappearing before it's hit by a kinetic round, or disappearing and avoiding a guided tank missile. But that's not even all. What we have here is what I consider, I wasn't fully able to confirm it, but from my understanding, this is actually thermal vision. And in this case, this would have better optics than most of the Russian tanks that are currently being used. As we see, a lot of the T-72A, T-72B, even the older T-80s do not have thermal visions. So this tank might actually have the advantage when it comes to spotting the opponent's tanks, and it has a chance of recognizing once it's being targeted. A laser warning receiver is also not common on most Russian tanks. So this tank, which is originally from the 50s, from the late 50s, should be vastly superior to this here. This doesn't make it a full match to the most modern equipment, obviously, but this just to put it in perspective, that while this could be easily be downplayed as cheap crap, as some scrap metal that's being handed here, in case they are well maintained, they might actually have some effect on the battlefield, as their fire control system was also modernized. This is overall modernizing that was done by the Israelis. So the fire control is modernized, the gun is modernized, there might be effective rounds for it, and thanks to the thermal vision, it might even have a chance to see the opponent earlier. And usually in modern combat, it is the side that wins is the one that spots the enemy first and then hits him first. And with modern fire control, thermal vision, and a modern gun, a better gun, it might actually be this tank. So I don't want to hype this tank. In some ways, that's also not justified, but just to put it in some perspective, this tank here should be vastly superior to this. And I'm pretty sure you can argue it's even superior to the T-72AV that we have also seen on the Russian side. That was it for now. When it came to the situation report that I have here, I'm going to go to the question and answer episode part of the stream. After taking a short break to have a drink, I'll play an ad during that time. I'll be back in 30 seconds. Okay, just to remind you, use hashtag question to ask questions, and I will see them in a bot is collecting the questions for me to allow me to answer. S House and Trees, thank you very much for your support. If you want to support the channel, you can use Super Chat and PayPal in case you want to support me doing this. The first question is, does Putin need hair club for men? Okay, I guess that's not too serious. What type of heavy weaponry do you think Germany will send if Schulz loses enough political capital to the mere pro-Ukrainian side of the political spectrum? Realistically, what is available are roughly 100 Leopard 1 and 100 It should be more or less 100 Marder. Now, I'm not completely sure those 40 that were promised to Greece are taking out of the 100 or not. But that were the last numbers. The industry might have some Leopard 2 left, which might join a pool of other Leopard 2 donators, because we talked about this here in the past. Delivering a few modern tanks is more or less useless to Ukraine. If you give them 10 tanks of one type, the struggle they have to put up to maintain them, to get supplies, to train mechanics is probably not worth the military benefit. In that case, 50 old T-72s might be a far better choice than 10 far superior modern tanks when they are in so much trouble keeping them running. There should be some Leopard 2 within the industry, but they are likely not enough to form a brigade. But if there are other nations donating Leopard 2, then this should be enough. So realistically, it'll be the Leopard 1s, which are not that bad either. So their armor is more or less laughable. They might be able to defeat modern autocannons from the front, but they don't have any chance against anti-tank missiles of any halfway modern kind or against APFSDS. But what they do have is thermal vision again. With this, also have the advantage to most of what the Russians use, as they can see earlier, and their guns can still be fairly potent. So Leopard 1s, Marders might be an option, and I don't think there is much left within the German artillery that can seriously be handed over without castrating the German military even more. So probably a handful of Leopard 2s when it comes to big equipment, the 100 Leopard 1s, and 60 to 100 Marder infantry fighting vehicles. With Russian mobilization, would attack MS be on the table? Obviously, I can't say that. It seems unlikely that Ukraine is receiving them, but as Russia is escalating, it might theoretically be up for the table, but this is pure guesswork from my side. I can't really comment with any competence on that question. The Ka-52 helicopter down today, was it down by a Starstreak missile? Are Starstreaks behind the large helicopter plane losses? Unfortunately, I haven't watched the video. I've seen that it was shot down, but usually I actually don't, if I'm not having too much time, which I lately don't have, I don't watch those single videos anymore unless there's something likely to gain from that, as I am collecting the informations and posting just one presenting one shot down. I could present you 50 videos of destroyed vehicle every single status report, and I don't want to draw it out just to have a longer video, so I leave this behind. So unfortunately, in this case, I can't really comment on it. Starstreak, in theory, is a fairly potent short-range system, especially as it is laser guided, if I'm not completely wrong, which would mean that the conventional countermeasures are more or less useless. And it's darts, so it's spreading up into 3 darts, which penetrate the skin and then explode. Those darts, I think, fly at Mach 3, so it is faster than the usual manpads as well. And it's a highly potent short-range air defense system, at least in theory. Again, the actual usage of it, I don't see it being used in that degree yet that we could generally comment on it of being a superior weapon system. But in theory, at least on paper, it is highly efficient system. But I said I can't really say about the recent losses or whether it shot down this particular Ka-52. Now, if one of those here in the thanks for the recommendation. If Fuzzy, for instance, if you know the video, posted in the channel you just posted, and we can actually look at it in a moment to see if we can identify anything here. Okay. Do you think it is possible for the Ukrainian offensive at Vuhledar to be towards the east, towards Donetsk, instead of south of Mariupol? Well, there are some theories that they could try to go around here, like to cut off supply lines towards Donetsk. If we look at the infrastructure, as said, Vuhledar itself doesn't seem to be that that ideally suited for any offensive when we look at the communications. It's not really a transport hub. Usually an offensive like this has to follow the lines of communication, because going cross the road with bigger forces is always kind of challenging. What they could theoretically do, what we see here, ridge lines, we see towns, and this is, we shouldn't forget, this is the old contact line. So this should be heavily fortified from the Russian side. Pushing through here should not happen within a day. That should take some time and some preparation, at least unless the forces are completely overrun and didn't have time to consolidate some defense in here, because with the current manpower shortage, we can assume there are those fortifications are standing empty right now. So unless they achieve a breakthrough, they have to pound themselves through tough fortifications here. And then we could see here, I mean, in theory, you could fantasize about it encircling Donetsk, but I don't see the benefit at the same time, because Donetsk is not going to capitulate within a few days, and at the same time, while you advance here, you open yourself a long front line where you could be encircled and cut off and thus be destroyed. So you take a huge risk the further you push to the depths without being able to cut them off. It's not like the Ukrainians are likely to have a pincer down here and one here and encircle that and then wipe out the troops in there within a week before the Russians can react and open supply routes, open communication lines into the cauldron again. So I don't see much where the Ukrainians could actually go there, where they could achieve something big, which would justify the effort. As of course there are some transport hubs, there's something what you can do, but the further they push into the Russian depth, the more risk they take. So the risk must be worth the reward. And the only thing I see here is Mariupol, but I've said in the past that it seems to me highly unlikely that the Ukrainians are actually able to push through to Mariupol and take it, because of the long distance and the need to widen the breakthrough and defend it to all sides to prevent such them being cut off there. Any thoughts on the what I'll call TikTok protests in Russia? More filmers than protesters, years of at least 4 opposition parties being infested by FSB. We see a few, I've seen a couple of videos of protests, and we see protests, as we can say, voting by the feet, if those things are more or less accurate. So we do see protests, but I don't, like, everything I know about Russia, and what I know is what I hear from experts. So I'm not claiming to be a Russia expert, but everything I know is that he can crush any dissent with force if necessary, and that all of those protests are more or less useless. That they will crush them. So I don't think there is much coming out of that at all. Okay, I see some issue here. I need to do that. Wait one moment. Just to make sure, because the bot kind of failed, but thanks to Anna, she picked up all the questions. So thank Anna for doing the good job of helping me collect the questions, that we don't waste useless time on that. When do you expect Kherson to be delivered? I wouldn't be surprised if it's not delivered in liberated in 2022. We see the very slow advances. I say it's deliberate, but it's deliberate out of necessity. That is important. It's not like the Ukrainians go slow because they want to. They go slow because they have to. We have deep fortification in depth. The Russians prepared for months to defend this area, and they have concentrated strong forces there. So any breakthrough there seems highly unlikely. And the next thing is, we are probably 4 weeks more or less away from the Rasputitsa. So when rain should more or less make moving across fields at least extremely slow, if not impossible, until the first frost. So that would mean any advances that are done by anything else than foot have to be concentrated on paved roads. And that benefits the defender massively, because he has the time to spread out in width, to create a crossfire, to lay ambush. The attacker has to stay on the paved road no matter what, because he can't move to the side he has no chance. And this is the issue that the Ukrainians will face in further advances. So from a few weeks from now, I'm not completely sure. It obviously varies too. It's when the autumn rain is hitting. That might be in 2 weeks, that might be in 6 weeks, but somewhere in that area, the Rasputitsa will begin, and that will make Ukrainian advances even slower. And then in the winter, the Russians had time to react, and likely the first units from the mobilization will be there, even if they don't do the rushing in as I have presented you as a possible option at the beginning of the stream. So I don't think Kherson will fall within this year. What if Russia attacked 10 years in the future or past, better or worse? Well, if we listen to the what Fiatov said, that Russian VDV fighter, he was in the armed forces 10 years ago, and then he came back, and instead of finding something more professional, he found something far worse. So if I understood him correctly, the Russian armed forces were better organized and better equipped when it came to the general equipment 10 years ago. They might not have had a fancy Su-57, and the T-90M wasn't there, and they didn't have the T-14 Armata presented. But when it came to general supply for the soldiers and likely the training, they were better 10 years ago. 10 years from now, with the Ukrainian armed forces were increasing, they were supposed to set up a production plant for the Bayraktar drones. So I think the Ukrainians were getting better over time, especially as Russia kept up the pressure and Ukraine was still receiving training, was building up its territorial defense forces. If give those enough time and you have them in bigger numbers and better trained, I think 10 years from now would have been far easier for the Ukrainians to defend. 10 years ago would likely be in Russia's favor. And this is actually meeting the descriptions of some analysts who said that Russia, for this advance, Russia needs those attacks to gain strategic depth. But this is basically its last chance because of its demography. It's increasingly lacking the potential to create a big army. And this would be inclined that the earlier it happens, the better for the Russians. Obviously, the Ukrainians are also facing the same population decline, but in defense, it is easier as the motivation usually is higher. I heard Ukraine received 6 German Leopard tanks today. Is that correct? Highly unlikely. I am not saying it's absolutely impossible, but I would bet it is not happening. That must be a rumor, especially from Germany. And the problem is that if the tanks were built in Germany, then the German government has its thumb on them. So another country is not allowed to export them without Germany greenlighting it, giving its green light. So in this regard, I would say it's close to impossible. Will the Russians now have to use T-55 tanks and 1950 MREs, let alone uniforms, for another 100,000 orcs? Thanks, Anna. So officially, there are no longer T-55s in their depots. I mentioned this a couple of times. The official reserve tank fleet of the Russian Federation before the war was roughly 12,000. But to my knowledge, they only had to report what's west of the Urals. So in the east, there might be more. And it would be of little surprise to anyone watching the Russian military if they had T-55 still. But we are talking likely, if they still have some, of some just being dumped on some forests, on some grass patches in some fields. So while they can be rebuilt, they very likely have to go into a proper tank plant, or at least some plant that is set up to modernize them, not to modernize them, to make them running again. If you have, as we know, Russia doesn't have a Yuma Desert. I think it's in the Yuma Desert where the Americans park their planes and their equipment. No rain, no humidity. Russia isn't like this. So everything that's outside is suffering by year. And at least the rubbers will have to be replaced, the engine will have to be rebuilt, etc. So we might see them at some point, but I wouldn't expect it too soon, as they still have T-72 in reserve. They even still should have T-80 in reserve, and T-62 of course, as well. So there might still be T-55s, but they are likely behind the Urals and likely rusting hulks as of now that need excessive work on them to make them running again. And that same work can be put into a T-72B, into a T-72A, or in an early T-80 to make it running again, to gain far more when it comes to efficiency on the battlefield. So we will not see them. Do you know the reverse speed of the M55S? Hoping it is not as slow as the other Soviet tanks. I'm pretty sure it's also fairly slow. I'm not sure if it's the 4.1 kilometers an hour with the T-72, but it was more or less built close to the same doctrine. As a tank that is supposed to advance, not to reverse. So the reverse gear is more or less for parking, not really for fighting a delaying battle, like most of the Western tanks are built for. So you would expect its reverse gear to be fairly slow as well. Will the winter favor Ukraine or Russia? Hard to say. When it comes to general skill, it should be more or less equal. The question will be, will Russia be able to supply all of its freshly raised troops, especially if we are talking about up to 1 million? Will they be able to supply them with winter gear? When we talk about hardware, both more or less use the Soviet type of hardware, so they should be more or less equal when it comes to winter capabilities. The difference will be obviously the Western delivered weaponry. A Bushmaster from Australia is probably not as capable in high snows as some Russian vehicles. But generally, I wouldn't see one side having a vast advantage over the other because they are more or less from the same region, so they more or less know how to handle it, what to do with it, and they more or less have equipment adequate for that. Will the support for Ukraine will raise after Russia started the mobilization? So will the support go up? Hard to say. Tendency in general, you would either expect the supporters to give up or to adjust its aid. And I don't think the aid to Ukraine is going to stop now. So it's likely that it's going to be raised, but that's a question of capabilities as well. So it is not really sure. I'm not really sure to. So I would expect it to go up, but I can't really confirm that. That's a guess. Lots of discussion about tanks, how long to train an effective tank crew. I think the usual training in the German army for you to be considered more or less capable in your one position is 4 to 6 months, if I'm not completely wrong. Now, after that, you supposedly know what you're doing, and you're knowing it fairly well, but you're not an expert at that point. So and then the question is, do you train somebody who's starting fresh, having never been in a tank before, or do you retraining someone? Obviously, if you take an experienced tanker and just put him in a different tank, you can expect him to more or less grasp what he's doing within a week. And especially with the T-55, we will have a tank that is close in doctrine to the T-72s, to the T-64s, etc. So tanks are built by doctrine, by request from in regards to the doctrine. So if the doctrine is fairly similar, its capabilities will somewhere slip in the same regions. Also, you can expect that they generally will have the controls more or less in the same regions, also to allow for easier switching. The T-55 is from the same country than the T-62, T-72, etc., T-64. So you can see some similarities there. It's obviously a total difference. It's obviously vastly different if we talk about Western tanks in this regard. But a Ukrainian tanker should be able to handle a Western tank within a week, more or less, but then he knows how to handle it. It doesn't mean he mastered it. And obviously, when it comes to combat, mastering a weapon system is highly important too, but there might simply not be the time. You can see it in a way if you look through the optics and you have to put your head away and look to the side to find the button to push. You obviously lose valuable time, and while you push the button, you might lose sight of your target. The experienced crew that mastered the vehicle will just keep looking and push the button because he knows exactly where it is. That would be the difference, and that would be one example of where a difference can mean life or death for a crew. But in war, obviously, there might have to be shortcuts. There might be shortcuts that have to be taken. What is happening in the north of the country along the border west of Kharkiv? Is there fighting or at least manned positions along the border? There are manned positions and occasionally there is shelling. I have reports about some shelling. Let me see, where is my map? I have a map that shows which units are identified. Let me get this. It's also linked in the description of the video, so you can find the maps yourself that I'm using. I have, which one is it? This here and this here, I think. Yep. Those two maps here. This is not showing anything, okay? But this one is. And here you can see, for instance, let's say Chernihiv is more or less protected right now by the 119th Defense Brigade and by the Chernihiv Company of the Special Police Force. As you can see, there are forces along the whole border everywhere because there need to be at least enough force to delay a further advance, but much of that will be handed over, as we see, to police forces and to territorial defenses. Would not all these troops, those troops trained or not, make it difficult for the armed forces of Ukraine to break through with any sort of advance? Yes. As said, those, especially if they had training 10 years ago, they will be of some use. They are far from being at the skill level that they're supposed to have for a serious army. And this will cost them dearly in losses. No question about that. But if you put 100 rookies in a trench, there's still at the beginning of the battle, that's still 100 rifles that might shoot. So it will make it difficult, and if the Russians are actually rushing forward the reinforcements, it will mean results fairly soon. As said, if the Russians don't care about the losses, then they will see an effect on the front line. We might see an effect within days. Where's Siegfried? Siegfried is to my right and sleeping the sleep of the just, as we say in Germany. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, I can't get his camera to work. Let me check it again, but I'm pretty sure I can't. Yeah. No chance. I might be able actually for a moment. If I just change my cam for a moment, let me see. Yep. Yeah, he's that sweet little boy sleeping. Do you see it? I think you should be able to see that now. Sweet little boy. There he is. Okay. I don't know why it's just working if I switch it here, but I can't set up a separate cam. I have no idea. Okay. What goals Ukrainians got to accomplish on Kherson front in which Russia would probably do organized retreat? Raise the supply usage to a degree that their combat power is getting diminished to a point where they are being threatened with being overrun. But in the end, Kherson is such a high price, I would not be surprised if the Russians retreat on the eastern side and, for instance, try to keep in the Inulet's frontier down to maybe the marshes here or whatever this is, just to hold on to Kherson, even if they have to push reinforcements through an indirect fire here across the river, because Kherson is like, losing Kherson would be a strategic defeat inside of that war. That doesn't lose Russia the war yet, but it would be a tremendous defeat. And especially now, as they will likely have the manpower, this will be a position. If they feel the need, they will rush in forces, because Kherson is almost worth being kept no matter what. That's the problem here for them. So I don't see. The Russians will only retreat if they know and accept that they can't hold it any longer, and their choice is to lose the garrison of Kherson to become prisoners of war or retreat them. I see this as the only chance. As said, in general, I would expect them to fight to the last as long as they control the bridge and maybe some area that can, not the bridge, the river banks. And as long as this area isn't in direct line of sight, they can still try to rush some reinforcements through, like the Ukrainians did it with Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. But unlike in that case, it is not possible for the Ukrainians within reasonable measures to cross the river and threaten the lines of communication from the flank as the Russians did here. Because this was more or less the same. You had a highly important town here it was more for moral reasons. Its strategic importance itself wasn't that big. But as long as the Ukrainians were controlling the way to the river and the river, they could rush in reinforcements. The moment they got threatened from the side, they withdrew. So as long as the Russians think they can reinforce Kherson, they will keep it. They will not give it up. I would be highly surprised if they did, because in my book, that's a strategic defeat. I said none that loses them the war, but one that is an absolute disaster for their war goals. What military equipment weapons will Russia most likely run short of first? Interesting question. It's hard to say, to be honest. They have plenty of everything. Oh, which weapon? Yeah, guided missiles. Guided missiles, likely. If we think about, first I thought about like artillery, planes, tanks, trucks, IFVs. They should have more than enough for a long war, but a lot of it is in storage. So having 20,000 tanks doesn't help you if they don't run. And that will be an issue. That will be an issue fairly soon when the Russians can't repair and refit and get the stuff running again within time. That will be an issue fairly soon. I'll take a short break to drink something. I'll be back in 30 seconds. If the Syrian uprising happened now, with the help of the rest of the world, would that stretch Russia too thin? I would guess there is not much potential left for a new uprising within the occupied territory. The war has been too brutal. Everyone who was willing to rise up should be killed by now or have fled. Now, that doesn't mean it's pacified forever. In 20 years, there's a new generation that might rise up again, but that we could expect behind the Syrian front lines. I guess that's what you mean. The people to rise up again, I think there's just not the potential left. We have losses in epic proportions, over 500,000 kills. There are killed. There are millions who have fled the country. So everyone's left is pacified, either because he supports Assad in the Assad territories, either because he supports Assad or because he is too intimidated. So I don't think a new Syrian uprising behind the front line is realistic, and those areas not controlled by the government yet, I don't think have the potential to likely threaten the government anytime soon yet. If the West would help those areas and maybe even intervene directly militarily, it would be a different story. And obviously they could now. They could have done it from the beginning. Russia never had the forces there to properly fight back serious enough invasion. But we all know that this is not an option anyways, because the West's taste for adventures in the Muslim world is kind of satisfied for now. How many HIMARS would be available if with Lend-Lease? How long will it take for the US to produce more systems and rockets? The US still have a fair amount of HIMARS, but I don't think it's more needed. The issue is ammunition. And they started production, they're ramping up production now, but I have to admit I've forgotten the exact numbers. So the US see the need for more missiles, and they are increasing the production, but all of it takes its time. And Ukraine doesn't need 50 different HIMARS systems. It needs enough missiles to use the systems it has right now all the time, and maybe replace losses once they start losing them. And that might be maybe the Shahed 136 drone is an appropriate weapon to hunt them down. We will see about that. But I don't think they actually need more HIMARS. It's a question of high value target. That's not a weapon you use, especially with the amount of ammo you have. It's not a weapon to use to support a direct advance by shelling the front line. So if you use it for pinpoint targets in the rear area of the opponent, then it's more a limit of ammunition and targets, not necessarily a limit of tubes that can fire. Could tanks cross a frozen Dnieper River? Yes and no. It simply depends on how thick the ice is. I know from historic reports that Lake Ilmen, there have been tanks on it. Let me show that to you. Lake Ilmen is, let's open this as well. Lake Ilmen is here, up here. So it should be colder than down here. It's roughly 15, 20 kilometers in size. What does it say how deep it is? Maximum depth, only 10 meters. Yeah. So it's very flat, which means it cools down really fast as it doesn't hold much volume. I know that on Lake Ilmen in World War II, there have been tanks. Now, I'm pretty sure there are some formulas on the internet to calculate how thick the ice has to be to carry which weight. And basically, as soon as you find that, Google that, look it up, and think about, let's say, 45 to 50, better 50 tons, how much is needed. That's probably, let's say, 2 meters of ice, more or less, something around that ballpark. And then the problem here is that the Dnieper is a flowing river. So it has to be really cold for really long. In theory, they could cross them. I would be highly surprised if it actually comes to that, as said, because it's a flowing river here. And here we have a reservoir with a huge volume. And obviously that means the time to cool down enough to actually create such an ice crust will take a lot of time. But in theory, it's possible, yes. Do you expect Ukraine to mirror a mobilization of Russia? I mean, they're already in full mobilization. The only thing they can do now is try to get more uniforms and more guns and stuff people in and send them to the front lines without training. And that was done in the first few days of the war. It seems to have more or less stopped now. I'm pretty sure they will continue their mobilization. I'm not, but as said, I said it earlier that I'm trying to get the information about the current state of the Ukrainian mobilization. I haven't been able to achieve that yet. So I know they did it in different waves, and I think they were at the third wave now. They have the manpower, they have the adult men for 4 or 5 waves, likely. They could probably match 2 million, 2.5 million men, something more or less like this, even though that would be a huge strain for the economy. And the question then is obviously again how to supply them, how to equip them, how to train them, how to lead them. Even if you train them, somebody needs to lead them, and an army without properly trained officers and NCOs is like a flock of hens. So Ukraine will try to keep up, but it'll be difficult for them. That much is sure. What does Ukraine need to do when fighting such large numbers of conscripts? Can they stop them sufficiently? They have to match it with skill. That's the issue. They can't match it with firepower. The Russians should have more than enough artillery pieces left. And I personally, maybe it's naive, it's not my specialty, but knowing how an artillery piece looks, I don't expect much to... I expect far less wear and tear for long-term storage than with like a tank. Starting with the fact that it doesn't a pulled artillery piece that isn't self-driven, doesn't have an engine, so it has less parts to break, etc. So in general, you would expect them to have artillery, and they have to fight them with higher skill. That's more or less it. Because in equipment-wise, they should be overwhelmed when it comes to pure numbers of equipment. Russia, in theory, has more than enough. The question is how much of it is still operable and how fast can they keep it up. And that is more a guesswork than anything else. We can't really know it. And we know that Russians are trying to set up 2 more plants for repairs, both of battle-damaged tanks as well as likely for tanks fresh out of storage. So the Russians are gearing up, and it'll be tough for Ukraine. They have to do it with superior skill, as nothing else they are basically superior in anymore. They don't have superior firepower when it comes to volume. They are superior in accuracy, but in heavy weapons, they are inferior in every regard. Do you have attrition rates for the military hardware? For instance, French mobile artillery vehicles sent from European countries to Ukraine. Very little. I have a few pictures of destroyed Ukrainian T-72M1. I've seen a few. Those are likely from the Poles. And is this only Russia now? I think he split it up. Yeah, I think he did. So Oryx is obviously the source for that. But I think now he only has the Russians in this article. He has an article about the Ukrainians as well, if I'm not completely wrong. Command posts. But I cannot confirm that any of the self-propelled artillery was destroyed yet. HIMARS, the Russians claimed a lot, never proven. Panzerhaubitze 2000, nothing proven. Caesar, they claimed that the Ukrainians actually sold it to them. But despite that being of great effect in morals, especially when it comes to weapon deliveries, they were incapable of proving it by showing a picture. So I might be wrong there, but I haven't heard about a single self-propelled artillery, maybe a 109. I think, yeah, I've seen destroyed Krab, I've seen actually, and 109 I think has also been destroyed. With the rest, I'm not sure. And I can't give you ratios there, that 10% is gone, 5% or 50%. Unfortunately, I can't. How are the Ruskies refueling their vehicles in Kherson Oblast? Obviously, with difficulties. The Russians have troops that lay pipelines. So there might be the possibility that the Russians used the time to actually lay a pipeline towards Kherson. If that is the case, then obviously they have it fairly easy, as long as the pipeline head isn't attacked. If not, then they have to bring them in with fuel trucks on the ferries. And that takes a lot of effort for fairly little gain. But there's always the possibility of pipelines, and that's actually fairly likely, even though I have no confirmation of it, because the Russian doctrine is basically exactly made for that. You push forward from your supply point, you pull the railway line and the pipelines afterwards, so the front line has fuel and supplies. So it should be, according to Russian doctrine, there should be a pipeline to Kherson pumping fuel there, and that should supply them. Is Russia well stocked in artillery tubes? Are sanctions affecting this? It should not. It should not affect it, because if we think about what an artillery piece is made of, Russia should have more or less autarky in producing it, if we're talking about just drawn artillery. And the exact numbers of artillery on stock, I don't know. I've forgotten that, but there should be plenty left. Again, the amount of stuff that the Russian keep in store is usually gigantic. There's this saying that the Russians never throw something away. They always keep it when it comes to the military hardware. And an artillery piece should have only limited wear and tear. Even if it's out in the wild, you have to maybe rebore and clean the tube to get rid of the rust, but a lot of the parts will likely be fairly easy to repair and get back in use. So this is not really my field of expertise, but I would highly be surprised if they run out of artillery pieces. What they might run out of is artillery ammunition, as the supposedly purchase from artillery munitions in North Korea would indicate. And of course, the the destruction of ammunition depots on the front line will harm them too. And if you don't have the shells on the front line, they are kind of useless in a depot in the backyard. But on the artillery piece, the HIMARS will reduce the volume of fire as long as they work in their intended way. But the pure number of troops, I would not count on them to be diminished in any serious way. List 1 to 5 equipment needed to Ukraine to bring the conflict to an end. Nukes. They would definitely help. I could say jets. The problem is they don't have pilots. They have a few pilots to spare that can be retrained. If somebody's giving them 200 F-16, they don't have anyone to fly it. So unless those planes come with foreign pilots, they're useless. So planes are not really an option. What can be supplied to them is 1 squadron or 2, or if they're really lucky, 3. And I don't know how far they want to go and take every private pilot, every airline pilot, and try to retrain him in a crash course into air combat, which will obviously mean insane losses. That might push the number further up. But the trained pilots that actually did a proper pilot training are in short supply. They are more than they have planes available, but not that many more. I have no real numbers, but realistically it's probably something of 40 or less. So planes would surely help, but 40 planes won't make the difference in the air war. They need... their recon is actually fairly good. They need a lot of self-propelled artillery, infantry fighting vehicles, main battle tanks. Probably drones to identify, and of course long-range artillery. But if we summarize that with artillery and already assume that they might gain even ATAK-MS, then the last equipment after self-propelled artillery, the main battle tanks, IFVs, drones would probably be more counter-battery radars to silence the Russian artillery as fast as possible. As we were just talking about drone artillery, this drone artillery is highly vulnerable to counter-battery fire as it lacks the mobility to shoot and scoot. Since Putin is 70, isn't it a bit risky to corner him with thousands of nukes available? I'm pretty sure he will do anything not to end up like Gaddafi. The thing is, it seems highly unlikely that he will end up like Gaddafi even if he loses the war. And using nukes will harm Russia to a degree that might cause a palace revolution and get rid of him. So that's a risk too. In the end, the Russian nukes have you have to more or less ignore the Russian nuclear threats and deal with them once they appear. For a very reason, if you allow Russia to blackmail the West with nuclear weapons, Russia will act like a gambler. If it works that he threatens nuclear weapons, then he will act like a gambler who thinks he has developed the winning method. He will up the stakes and go into his next game. So if he thinks nukes are all that's needed to get what he needs, then he will ask for more and threaten nukes until he reaches a point where the West where the West says, not even under the threat of nukes, we will give in and give you what you want. And then he's faced with the question to admit complete defeat or actually use nukes, or he might cause the West to do a first strike trying to avoid him using nukes, as he has pushed the West into a corner where he, after threatening nukes. So the threat of Russian nukes should be more or less ignored, as it means the end of the Russian Federation in a strategic sense. If he is actually using nukes outside of Ukraine against the NATO, then Russia ceases to exist. And that is not in his interest, and that is not in any way likely, and you should not give in to threats. Now, what might theoretically be possible is the employment of tactical nukes within Ukraine. But that is a different question that has to be addressed in a certain way, how you want to try to face this, whether you want to try threatening nuclear retaliation yourself, or whether you want to threaten getting involved in the war yourself by sending your own troops. That's a whole different question. But in general, blackmail, nuclear blackmail must not be given in, because it makes nuclear weapon use more likely, as it will make the nation that is using it for blackmail, it makes it more susceptible, I think is the word, to try it again. Russia is immune from any serious threat, because nobody intends to annex Rostov-on-Don, Volgograd, or conquer Moscow. So that would be a reasonable and understandable use of Russian nukes when they face complete defeat, as nobody even wants to really cross the border. Those threats should be more or less ignored. If Russia can't afford to lose, can the US afford to lose against Russia? How far do you think the US is willing to go to stop Russia? In the end, the question, again, we could circle around the nukes again, but how far is the US willing to go? Now, if Russia wins this war, but it wins it after 7 years, then it doesn't really matter anymore that it won it. Because the big threat for Europe, the big threat for NATO is that Russia's strategic interests, once it decides to solve them by force, will not end with Ukraine. If it's about having NATO close to its core, then the Baltics have to be also taken. If it's about geographic barriers to allow for easier defense of Russia, then they have to not just reach this part of the Carpathian Mountains, but this part as well, which is well within NATO. And they should probably reach the Vistula here to basically connect Kaliningrad more or less down along some easy to defend route with the Carpathian Mountains. So whatever you see the reason of this war now, it cannot end from the Russian side. It will not end with Ukraine. Now, this is not an issue if Russia is no longer able to go further. So let's say it's cynically dry, and I know there are some who don't know me yet, who are pro-Ukrainian and haven't learned yet that I am completely dry and fact-based and don't really care too much, even though my sympathy is with Ukraine. That doesn't mean I ignore facts and I ignore realities and that I ignore arguments. And the thing is, if right now NATO is in a fantastic situation when it comes to the Russian threat. Every day, more Russian soldiers die. Every day, more Russian tanks get blown up. And every soldier that is dead, every tank that is blown up will never cross NATO border. So the longer the war lasts, the more Russian equipment the Ukrainians destroy, the more soldiers they kill, the better it is for NATO. Because Russia is getting diminished as a potential threat. Now, if Russia finally wins after a 5-year struggle, it will no longer be able to threaten NATO within a few decades. And within that time, its demographic decline will make the whole country collapse. So Russia is finished. If that war lasts a little bit longer, Russia is finished for NATO as a threat. So it needs to be kept going. Whether it then keeps the line along the Dnieper or not is for the threat of Central Europe more or less irrelevant. Now that's on the back of the Ukrainians. And I can guarantee you in Ukrainian leadership circles, they know that very well too. They even say it openly. They say, we don't just fight for Ukraine, we fight for Europe. Because they say what I say, if Russia wins in Ukraine, they will continue. And they also say, give us the weapon, we are willing to fight. Now, NATO now has a fantastic point from a realpolitik point of view. NATO has somebody who is willing to shed his own blood to defeat Russia, to kill as many Russian soldiers and as many Russian tanks as possible. That's a fantastic outcome for NATO. That doesn't mean NATO is cold towards Ukraine. That doesn't mean NATO doesn't care about Ukraine. I guarantee you, basically everyone in NATO wants Ukraine to be an independent, healthy, democratic, free state, etc. But the reality is still also there. And the reality is there if Russia wins, but only after, as it is said, to bleed someone white, which means there's no more blood coming out. After a complete attritional battle, when Russia has lost the last drop of blood it can shed, and it can't shed blood anymore. So Russia is taken out as a opponent, as a threat, even after winning in Ukraine. Now that will not be a complete solution, because Russia still will have demonstrated that with military force you can extend your territory again, and that will encourage others to try the same. So in a global perspective, it is still kind of bad, but it's far less of a disaster than a fast victory in Ukraine would have been. So if all the US need to do is to make sure Ukraine isn't losing, and there are actually accusations that the West doesn't even try to make Ukraine, to enable Ukraine to win the war, that they are just making sure they're not losing it. And that would basically be, I haven't heard it being spelled out in this way, but it would basically be what I just said would be the logical consequence out of those accusations. If you don't equip Ukraine to win, but just to hold out for long enough, then you'd still achieve your goal. So how long will the US continue? I'm pretty sure they will continue. The question is, will they deliver enough weapons and enough high quality weapons to allow the Ukrainians to win even against a mobilizing Russia? If that 1 million rumor is true, then it's obviously a whole different story than the 300,000, and we might see it continue after that 1 million too. If Russia is going all in and doesn't care about human losses. So yeah. It is in the West's interest and in NATO's interest to make Russia suffer the highest loss possible, even if it wins, or to defeat it completely. And for NATO's benefit, there is somebody willing to shed his own blood to achieve that with the Ukrainians. Not really nice, especially as I might have Ukrainian viewers, but you will have to learn that I do it this way. I'm not sugarcoating things. In America, they have military families. Do you have them in Russia, Ukraine too? Good mobilization in Russia will see family members like cousins fighting against each other. It's already known that it's happening. Here in Donbass, for instance. There are known examples of brothers where one brother is fighting on the side of the separatists and one is in the Ukrainian armed forces. So it's already known. And yes, of course, there are military families as well. It might be a little different as a lot of them, there's hardly, like a lot of Russians don't leave the army after just a 4-year stint because the lifestyle in the army isn't as attractive for a regular soldier that he wants to stay in for 20 or 30 years, usually. So you have officers obviously going through the careers, and that's more or less it. The rest is being exchanged every few years. So there are families where everyone along the male line has served, but it's less likely that everyone along the male line has served for 20 years unless it was a whole family of officers. But I know of those military families as well. Is it true that most artillery pieces have to be decommissioned after 1,000 to 2,000 fired rounds? The exact numbers obviously vary, and they differentiate on a various amount of things as well. I think the lowest number I've heard was 600 rounds for battleship guns, but those also depend on the shell type. So if on a battleship gun, let's say a 16-inch gun, you shoot an armor-piercing round, it has much more wear and tear on the barrel than a high-explosive round. And then in modern artillery often has like, what is it called? Like powder bags. And then it also makes a difference how big the loads are. So I think the Panzerhaubitze 2000 can shoot with 3 powder bags. That will have more wear and tear than if you just shoot with 1. So there are variations in it when it comes to shell type, when it comes to powder load. But yes, it has wear and tear. That doesn't mean they have to be decommissioned, though. That just means that the barrel has to be rebored. So you take out the barrel, ideally. You shove in a spare barrel, and the old barrel is being put on a truck, driven to some steelworks, and is being rebored. And that can be done a couple of times, and then it has to be melted up, and you need new barrels. So that is generally true, but in general, it should not be the make or break point. Whether the Russians have kept them on storage, I've seen a few examples of blown up barrels as well, but some of them at least seem to have been from the so-called People's Republics, and they might not be fully connected to the system within Russia, so they might not have access to spare barrels. But in general, you're right, but that doesn't mean it's a problem that can't be solved, and there are actually measures in place to solve it. When will trained troops from the UK start arriving in Ukraine? I think they should already be arriving. I read about some examples of them. I read about an article where it said that the troops have already finished their training. Can you discuss the issues, difficulties, and consequences of opening a third front, for instance, towards Melitopol, as some Ukrainians have called for? It's a question of strength. Now, you need strategic reserves. Otherwise, you don't have anything in case the opponent attacks, which means you need to keep troops back in case in one front it goes bad, so you can send reinforcements. That, first of all, Ukraine very likely still has them. Those reserves can, in rare cases, be used to reinforce a breakthrough. If you feel like you have that one offensive that wins you the war, of course, you push in your strategic reserves as well. The question is, are they actually able to create another significant offensive force while keeping the strategic reserve, especially as now we might expect the first thousands of troops to arrive within a week on the front line? And then, if we look at the attack here, we have 70 kilometers, more or less. 80. So not only do you have to push 80 kilometers in depth, once you reach this, you probably should go like to Danilo Ivanivka or something like this to make sure that there's actually, it's sealed off here. So we are talking about more or less 90 kilometers now. Not only do you push 90 kilometers in depth, but the force that is pushing down will obviously suffer losses. Once it's there, you have an opening here through the front line where you have pushed the opponents to each side. And they can come back and cut you off and destroy you. So what you need is not just a force strong enough to pierce down, but you need significant forces the deeper you go into their line to cover the flanks. So you have 90 kilometers pushing forward, and then you have 90 kilometers on this side and 90 kilometers on this side. So another 180 kilometers front that has to be strong enough, basically on the full width, to prevent the Russians to push through and cut off the strong spearhead towards Melitopol, because that would be the complete destruction of it. And not only this, those forces going to the side basically need to be strong enough to widen it. Because if you just go down the M18, all that's needed is one small concentrated push and you are cut off. So you need buffer to each side. Basically, you should widen that gap by ideally 50 kilometers, maybe this here. This here would be more realistic. Tokmak somewhere down here. Ideally, rather here. So you have some buffer, so you can go into a mobile defense and don't have to hold anything. Now calculate how much it takes to clear those towns where there are Russian garrisons, Russian back supply troops that will join the fighting once you reach them. To push at the same time, conquer Melitopol in house-to-house fighting, because that should be a point where the Russians should fight for it, because it's of strategic value. You need enough troops to win house-to-house fighting in Melitopol, while you need enough troops to push it to the west and to the east, further out, and then be strong enough to to hold back further attacks. Do the Ukrainians actually have that? And do they still have a strategic reserve after that to defend against a Russian breakthrough on the Donbass or a sudden Russian counteroffensive in Kherson or in Kharkiv? That's why I'm saying the whole time, if you follow this channel for a while, that I'm highly doubtful about a serious Ukrainian offensive right now. And with the mobilization, they might feel the pressure to achieve something before that mobilization gets full effect. So we might actually see an offensive fairly soon. But whether it's a wise choice or not, I've just said the difficulties I see, which in my book don't seem to make too much sense in this case. Especially if they are still having offensive troops here. Now, if they rotate those out, put territorial defense or something like this here and some backwater troops to hold it, that might work then. If they take the offensive troops from here and maybe combine them with some more here. But as of now, 3 offensives at the same time is extremely ambitious. I don't say it's impossible. I just say regarding the balance of power so far in this war, To expect the Ukrainians to suddenly be able to do 3 major simultaneous offensives is fairly optimistic, and I don't see that optimism being justified. But this is a general understanding that I have, and not exactly the knowledge of specific units and specific strength, which I think in open source are more or less unavailable. If Russia uses tactical or any type of nukes, will US NATO respond? They will definitely, but there's hardly anything to say how. I don't think there will be nuclear retaliation. I don't think there will be the obvious thing, which would even be fair in quotation marks, which is to give Ukraine nukes because they gave theirs up after the Budapest Memorandum in exchange for the guarantees of their borders. And if Russia is using tactical nukes, so should Ukraine be, but they probably couldn't even employ them because they have nothing to drop them with, etc. And of course, it would be a breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But there will be some response. But what is hard to tell. And I'm going to make a video exploring the potential responses fairly soon as well. I'm going to take a quick ad break again to drink something. I'll be right back. Will Russia have the upper hand in the winter since they have more artillery and forests will show more Ukrainian troops? Will Ukraine not face heating issues like EU? Civilian issues are not directly related to the military issues in my book. So obviously civilian will have heating issues, water pipes breaking, power outages, windows having been broken through artillery fire, meaning civilians are in danger of freezing to death. That doesn't necessarily translate to the Ukrainian ground forces. Reconnaissance should be easier from the air, and thus artillery more effective. But that goes a little both ways. And when it comes to precision artillery, at least, the Ukrainians now have the upper hand. So I wouldn't say it's that easily to say one side will have a massive advantage. Thanks for the answer. Imagine Russia buying back ammunition from North Korea. They sold them decades ago. Yeah. Now I will turn off. I have a couple of questions left. I will not answer more questions after those because we're already at 2 hours and 15 minutes. I will just try to answer the questions that were asked until now. How many night vision kits have been donated to Ukraine? No idea. Will they be crucial in winter night fighting, scouting behind lines? They're already crucial and already highly important. And I guess in winter you could expect thermal vision to be a little more useful, but it shouldn't make that much of a difference. So the night vision equipment is highly important. And I've seen a lot of images of donations, but to the total quantity is probably, I wouldn't be surprised if nobody in Ukraine would know it, because a lot of it has been private donations to specific units as well. A Ukrainian volunteer against Russian conscript. I wonder what the effect of UK, Canada, etc. training volunteers is having as opposed to Russian conscript training, if any. The quality of the Ukrainian soldier should be significantly higher, both because of training, especially once those masses roll on, and also because of morale. They know what they're fighting for. The Russians, not as much. So I would expect not insignificant numbers of Russian trying to capitulate and switch sides, go over to the Ukrainian side to save their lives. This will obviously lead to the political commissars. They actually have them again to try to shoot them. That they might encourage their own comrades to shoot them. But in general, the individual Ukrainian soldier should have the advantage when it comes to morale and discipline. I would expect, at least. But if they actually do the 1 million mobilization, the numbers are probably tilting towards the Russian side again. What's the new Swedish government's position on joining NATO? Actually, I haven't. I know that the Sweden Democrats, I think, won the election, but I have so much to do that I didn't follow this in detail at that point. So I unfortunately can't really answer that. How is Germany going to survive winter when your bread factories are already going bankrupt for electricity prices? It's going to be interesting. Let's put it this way. David Keck, thank you for the donation. Why have we not seen any more Russian ships attacked in the Black Sea? They are pulling them back. There were reports of the Russians moving their fleet out of Sevastopol, which kind of makes sense, at least for the submarines. The reports were that they're moving them back as well. I said in the last stream, I think it was the English stream as well, that the likely reason for that is that the stocks in Caliber in Sevastopol are exhausted, and they are probably going to rearm them from now on in Novorossiysk down here. And I'm petting Siegfried. Oh, and the camera is off. I'm petting Siegfried. So in case you wonder what I'm doing here, because the boy has woken up and I don't want him to jump on my lap or run around the keyboard and sabotage everything. So the Ukrainians have received a lot of anti-ship missiles. They have their own Neptune, they have received Harpoon, and they have received RB something from Norway, I think. And the British have given them something too. So they can't really do much. They are left basically to employing cruise missiles, and there they mostly employ Caliber, which are being used from the Kilo-class submarines in the Black Sea, and they are being moved down. They are being moved down into the Black Sea, and now I guess to Novorossiya and the Novorossiysk. And the easy reason for that would be that the stocks here are exhausted, and it basically doesn't make a difference whether they supply them here or here. Whereas here they would have to use the limited lines of communication to get the stuff into Crimea. Whereas here, Novorossiysk is basically connected to the whole road network and railroad network within Russia. So that would kind of make sense. But I wouldn't expect the Russian fleet to venture out any much more into, I don't know, is this called the Bay of Odessa? Something in this direction. What? If Russia annexes the 4 oblasts, does that automatically mean they can use nukes according to their nuclear doctrine as Ukrainians are on Russian territory? If they are threatened with conventional defeat, yes. De-escalate to de-escalate means you show with the usage of nuclear weapons that you are capable and willing to use them, and thus basically expect the opponent to back down. And that obviously would be applicable within Ukraine's territory as well once it's annexed. The thing is, though, that he said the 3 parts of using nukes, of annexing and mobilization at different parts of his speech. So he deliberately didn't make a connection. I was writing speeches in the past, so you would put this together if you want a direct connection and show when-then scenario. This was a veiled threat, but it is not. It's far from guaranteed that they are using it. That he is even closely close to consider using it, especially as the using of nuclear weapons would diminish Russia's foreign policy connections even more. Even China and India would likely lose patience with Russia in a case like this. If Putin keeps going all in, North Korean troops, African mercenaries, all autocracies help anything possible, but no nuclear weapons, would the West have enough resources to win? If the West switches to war production fast enough, no doubt in general. I mean, the West's economic power is far superior. But if we have German tank factories producing 1 self-propelled howitzer per month, that's not going to win it. But for that, you have to do something, and it takes a while. So in theory, yes. The question is this is a complete what-if scenario. How fast would North Korean troops be deployed? How many? 50,000 that are being rotated through and reinforced and the losses are being replaced is a different story than 500,000 at once. So we're talking in a vast what if scenario. But I mean, US is the biggest economic power. The European Union was, at least before all of this crisis and factories shutting down, the biggest economic area. So it had a bigger economy, depending on the calculation, even than the US. If both of them work together, they produce, what is it, like 40% of the world's industrial output, more or less? Of course they can compete that. Russia has an economy smaller than Italy. They can, but they have to, and it costs, and you are willing to do. And as of now, there is no sign of it actually coming close to that. I've heard US might send M46 patterns instead of Abrams. Is the pattern a match for the Russian armor? I'm pretty sure it's not M46. M46 should be long scrapped. The only thing that might realistically still be available in the US is the M60, even though I doubt it's still on stock. The M60 also has the 105 rifled cannon, the same one the M55S has that I mentioned, the same one the Leopard has. So the firepower itself would be kind of okay. Depends on the version, how well the fire control is. The armor is in modern Battlefield more or less laughable. Not much different than the Leopard or the T55, so probably good enough for some autocannon fire from the front, but anything else basically go through like butter. So they would surely be of some use. And if we see T62Ms appearing in something, they might be a fair match for them. But I kind of doubt that there are significant stocks of that left in the US. There might be some in Spain. I think Spain had a lot of them. The Israelis might theoretically have some, even though they're not going to deliver them. The Turks have M48, which are fairly modernized. So there is a theoretical possibility of tanks like that being delivered, M60 and 48. But I wouldn't expect anything of that. Yeah, I have no idea what he did now. That's interesting. Okay, I can't even see the screen anymore. I have no idea what you're seeing. He somehow turned on like a scope. Okay, I see he also turned off the speaker, so I don't even know what you heard anymore. I can't answer anything. I don't know how to turn this off. I don't see anything on my screen anymore. Yeah, thank you very much. If you enjoyed this, despite this catastrophe of an end, please consider subscribing. Please recommend the channel to your friends and acquaintances. Don't forget the bell buttons, leave a comment and a like. If you want to support the channel and maybe help me buy some kind of cage that I can put over my keyboard so this doesn't happen again, little boy. If you want to support the channel, you find the options in the description, but I can't continue because I can't even see your questions anymore. I can't see the screen where I surveil the stream. I'm helpless. I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea how to get the screen visible again. he sabotaged everything. Thank you for watching. That's it for me now. I will probably cuddle that little boy because you can't really be mad at him. But yeah, that's it for me now. I hope you enjoyed it despite this catastrophe of an end. Thank you for watching. See you next time.